Part 2. Blood of the Beast. The white race and its heroes. White people cannot, in the generality, be taken as models of how to live. Rather, the white man is himself in sore need of new standards, which will release him from his confusion and place him once again in fruitful communion with the depths of his own being. James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. Right from the go, let me make one thing absolutely clear. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a white man. Nor, I hasten to add, am I now a black Muslim, although I used to be. But I am an old Fae watcher, a member of that uncharted, amorphous league which has members on all continents and the islands of the seas. Old Fae Watchers Anonymous, we might be called, because we exist concealed in the shadows wherever colored people have known oppression by whites, by white enslavers, colonizers, imperialists, and neo-colonialists. Did it irritate you, compatriot, for me to string those epithets out like that? Tolerate me. My intention was not necessarily to sprinkle salt over anyone's wounds. I did it primarily to relieve a certain pressure on my brain. Do you cop that? If not, then we're in trouble, because we Fae watchers have a pronounced tendency to slip into that mood. If it is bothersome to you, it is quite a task for me, because not too long ago it was my way of life to preach, as ardently as I could, that the white race is a race of devils, created by their maker to do evil and make evil appear as good. That the white race is the natural, unchangeable enemy of the black man, who is the original man, owner, maker, cream of the planet Earth. That the white race was soon to be destroyed by Allah, and that the black man would then inherit the earth, which has always, in fact, been his. I have, so to speak, washed my hands in the blood of the martyr, Malcolm X, whose retreat from the precipice of madness created new room for others to turn about in, and I am now caught up in that tiny space, attempting a maneuver of my own. Having renounced the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, I find that a rebirth does not follow automatically of its own accord, that a void is left in one's vision, and this void seeks constantly to obliterate itself by pulling one back to one's former outlook. I have tried a tentative compromise by adopting a select vocabulary, so that now when I see the whites of their eyes, instead of saying devil or beast, I say imperialist or colonialist, and everyone seems to be happier. In silence, we have spent our years watching the old Faes, trying to understand them on the principle that you have a better chance coping with the known than with the unknown. Some of us have been, and some still are, interested in learning whether it is ultimately possible to live in the same territory with people who seem so disagreeable to live with. Still others want to get as far away from old Faes as possible. What we share in common is the desire to break the old Faes' power over us. At times of fundamental social change, such as in the era in which we live, it is easy to be deceived by the onrush of events, beguiled by the craving for social stability into mistaking transitory phenomena for enduring reality. The strength and permanence of white backlash in America is just such an illusion. However much this rearguard action might seem to grow in strength, the initiative and the future rest with those whites and blacks who have liberated themselves from the master-slave syndrome, and these are to be found mainly among the youth. Over the past 12 years, there has surfaced a political conflict between the generations that is deeper even than the struggle between the races. Its first dramatic manifestation was within the ranks of the Negro people, when college students in the South, fed up with Uncle Tom's hat-in-hand approach to revolution, threw off the yoke of the NAACP. When these students initiated the first sit-ins, their spirit spread like a raging fire across the nation, and the technique of nonviolent, direct action, constantly refined and honed into a sharp cutting tool, swiftly matured. The older Negro leaders, who are now all die-hard advocates of this tactic, scolded the students for sitting in. The students rained down contempt upon their hoary heads. In the pre-sit-in days, these conservative leaders had always succeeded in putting down insurgent elements among the Negro people. A measure of their power prior to the students' rebellion is shown by their success in isolating such great black men as the late W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. When these stalwarts, refusing to bite their tongues, lost favor with the U.S. government by their unstinting efforts to link up the Negro Revolution with national liberation movements around the world. The, quote, Negro leaders and the whites who depended upon them to control their people were outraged by the impudence of the students, calling for a moratorium on student initiative. They were greeted instead by an encore of sit-ins, and retired to their ivory towers to contemplate the new phenomenon. Others, less prudent, because held on a tighter leash by the whites, had their careers brought to an abrupt end because they thought they could lead a black-white backlash against the students, only to find themselves in a kind of Bay of Pigs. Negro college presidents who expelled students from all Negro colleges in an attempt to quash the demonstrations ended up losing their jobs. The victorious students would no longer allow them to preside over the campuses. The spontaneous protest on southern campuses over the repressive measures of their college administrations were an earnest of the free speech upheaval which years later was to shake the UC campus at Berkeley. In countless ways, the rebellion of the black students served as a catalyst for the brewing revolt of the whites. What has suddenly happened is that the white race has lost its heroes. Worse, its heroes have been revealed as villains, and its greatest heroes as the arch-villains. The new generations of whites, appalled by the sanguine and despicable record carved over the face of the globe by their race in the last 500 years, are rejecting the panoply of white heroes, whose heroism consisted in erecting the inglorious edifice of colonialism and imperialism. Heroes whose careers rested on a system of foreign and domestic exploitation rooted in the myth of white supremacy and the manifest destiny of the white race. The emerging shape of a new world order and the requisites for survival in such a world are fostering in young whites a new outlook. They recoil in shame from the spectacle of cowboys and pioneers, their heroic forefathers whose exploits filled earlier generations with pride, galloping across a movie screen, shooting down Indians like Coke bottles. Even Winston Churchill, who was looked upon by older whites as perhaps the greatest hero of the 20th century, even he, because of the system of which he was a creature and which he served, is an arch-villain in the eyes of the young white rebels. At the close of World War II, national liberation movements in the colonized world picked up new momentum and audacity, seeking to cash in on the democratic promises made by the Allies during the war. The Atlantic Charter, signed by President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill in 1941, affirming, quote, the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they may live, end quote, established the principle, although it took years of post-war struggle to give this piece of rhetoric even the appearance of reality. And just as world revolution has prompted the oppressed to reevaluate their self-image in terms of the changing conditions, to slough off the servile attitudes inculcated by long years of subordination, the same dynamics of change have prompted the white people of the world to reevaluate their self-image as well, to disabuse themselves of the master race psychology developed over centuries of imperial hegemony. It is among the white youth of the world that the greatest change is taking place. It is they who are experiencing the great psychic pain of waking into consciousness to find their inherited heroes turned by events into villains. Communication and understanding between the older and younger generations of whites has entered a crisis. The elders who, in the tradition of privileged classes or races, genuinely do not understand the youth, trapped by old ways of thinking and blind to the future, have only just begun to be vexed because the youth have only just begun to rebel. So thoroughgoing is the revolution in the psyches of white youth that the traditional tolerance which every older generation has found it necessary to display is quickly exhausted, leaving a gulf of fear, hostility, mutual misunderstanding, and contempt. The rebellion of the oppressed peoples of the world, along with the Negro Revolution in America, have opened the way to a new evaluation of history, a re-examination of the role played by the white race since the beginning of European expansion. The positive achievements are also there in the record, and future generations will applaud them. But there can be no applause now, not while the master still holds the whip in his hand. Not even the master's own children can find it possible to applaud him. He cannot even applaud himself. The negative rings too loudly. Slave catchers, slave owners, murderers, butchers, invaders, oppressors. The white heroes have acquired new names. The great white statesmen whom school children are taught to revere are revealed as the architects of systems of human exploitation and slavery. Religious leaders are exposed as condoners and justifiers of all these evil deeds. School teachers and college professors are seen as a clique of brainwashers and whitewashers. The white youth of today are coming to see, intuitively, that to escape the onus of the history their fathers made, they must face and admit the moral truth concerning the works of their fathers. That such venerated figures as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owned hundreds of black slaves. That all of the presidents up to Lincoln presided over a slave state, and that every president since Lincoln connived politically and cynically with the issues affecting the human rights and general welfare of the broad masses of the American people. These facts weigh heavily upon the hearts of these young people. The elders do not like to give these youngsters credit for being able to understand what is going on and what has gone on. When speaking of juvenile delinquency, or the rebellious attitude of today's youth, the elders employ a glib rhetoric. They speak of the, quote, alienation of youth, end quote, the desire of the young to be independent, the problems of the father image and the mother image, and their effect upon growing children who lack sound models upon which to pattern themselves. But they consider it bad form to connect the problems of the youth with the central event of our era, the national liberation movements abroad, and the Negro Revolution at home. The foundations of authority have been blasted to bits in America because the whole society has been indicted, tried, and convicted of injustice. To the youth, the elders are ugly Americans. To the elders, the youth have gone mad. The rebellion of the white youth has gone through four broadly discernible stages. First, there was an initial recoiling away, a rejection of the conformity which America expected and had always received sooner or later from its youth. The disaffected youth were refusing to participate in the system, having discovered that America, far from helping the underdog, was up to its ears in the mud trying to hold the dog down. Because of the publicity and self-advertisements of the more vocal rebels, this period has come to be known as the beatnik era. Although not all of the youth affected by these changes thought of themselves as beatniks. The howl of the beatniks and their scathing, outraged denunciation of the system, characterized by Ginsburg as Moloch, a bloodthirsty Semitic deity to which the ancient tribes sacrificed their firstborn children, was a serious, irrevocable declaration of war. It is revealing that the elders looked upon the beatniks as mere obscene misfits who were too lazy to take baths and too stingy to buy a haircut. The elders had eyes but couldn't see, ears but couldn't hear. Not even when the message came through as clearly as in this remarkable passage from Jack Kerouac's On the Road. At lilac evening, I walked with every muscle aching among the lights of 27th and Walton in the Denver colored section, wishing I were a Negro, feeling that the best the white world had offered was not enough ecstasy for me, not enough life, joy, kicks, darkness, music, not enough night. I wished I were a Denver Mexican, or even a poor overworked Jap. Anything but what I so drearily was, a white man disillusioned. All my life I had white ambitions. I passed the dark porches of Mexican and Negro homes. Soft voices were there. Occasionally, the dusky knee of some mysterious sensuous gal. The dark faces of the men behind rose arbors. Little children sat like sages in ancient rocking chairs. The second stage arrived when these young people, having decided emphatically that the world and particularly the USA was unacceptable to them in its present form, began an active search for roles they could play in changing the society. If many of these young people were content to lay up in their cool beat pads, smoking pot and listening to jazz in a perpetual orgy of esoteric bliss, there were others, less crushed by the system, who recognized the need for positive action. Moloch could not ask for anything more than to have its disaffected victims withdraw into safe, passive, apolitical, little non-participatory islands in an economy less and less able to provide jobs for the growing pool of unemployed. If all the unemployed had followed the lead of the beatniks, Moloch would gladly have legalized the use of euphoric drugs and marijuana, passed out free jazz albums and sleeping bags to all those willing to sign affidavits promising to remain beat. The non-beat disenchanted white youth were attracted magnetically to the Negro Revolution, which had begun to take on mass, insurrectionary tone. But they had difficulty understanding their relationship to the Negro, and what role whites could play in a Negro revolution. For the time being, they watched the Negro activists from afar. The third stage, which is rapidly drawing to a close, emerged when white youth started joining Negro demonstrations in large numbers. The presence of whites among the demonstrators emboldened the Negro leaders and allowed them to use tactics they never would have been able to employ with all black troops. The racist conscience of America is such that murder does not register as murder, rarely unless the victim is white. And it was only when the newspapers and magazines started carrying pictures and stories of white demonstrators being beaten and maimed by mobs and police that the public began to protest. Negroes have become so used to this double standard that they too react differently to the death of a white. When white freedom riders were brutalized along with blacks, a sigh of relief went up from the black masses, because the blacks knew that white blood is the coin of freedom in a land where for 400 years black blood has been shed unremarked and with impunity. America has never truly been outraged by the murder of a black man, woman, or child. White politicians may, if Negroes are aroused by a particular murder, say with their lips what they know with their minds they should feel with their hearts, but don't. It is a measure of what the Negro feels that when the 2 white and 1 black civil rights workers were murdered in Mississippi in 1964, the event was welcomed by Negroes on a level of understanding beyond and deeper than the grief they felt for the victims and their families. This welcoming of violence and death to whites can almost be heard. Indeed, it can be heard in the inevitable words oft repeated by Negroes, that those whites and blacks do not die in vain. So it was with Mrs. Viola Liuzzo, and much of the anger which Negroes felt toward Martin Luther King during the Battle of Selma stemmed from the fact that he denied history a great moment, never to be recaptured, when he turned tail on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and refused to all those whites behind him what they had traveled thousands of miles to receive. If the police had turned them back by force, all those nuns, priests, rabbis, preachers, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, old and young, as they had done the Negroes a week earlier, the violence and brutality of the system would have been ruthlessly exposed. Or if seeing King determined to lead them on to Montgomery, the troopers had stepped aside to avoid precisely the confrontation that Washington would not have tolerated, it would have signaled the capitulation of the militant white South. As it turned out, the march on Montgomery was a show of somewhat dim luster, staged, managed by the establishment. But by this time the young whites were already active participants in the Negro Revolution. In fact, they had begun to transform it into something broader, with the potential of encompassing the whole of America in a radical reordering of society. The fourth stage, now in its infancy, sees these white youth taking the initiative, using techniques learned in the Negro struggle to attack problems in the general society. The classic example of this new energy in action was the student battle on the UC campus at Berkeley, California, the free speech movement. Leading the revolt were veterans of the civil rights movement, some of whom spent time on the firing line in the wilderness of Mississippi and Alabama. Flowing from the same momentum were student demonstrations against U.S. interference in the internal affairs of Vietnam, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and the Congo, and U.S. aid to apartheid in South Africa. The students even aroused the intellectual community to actions and positions unthinkable a few years ago. Witness the teachings, but their revolt is deeper than single-issue protest. The characteristics of the white rebels, which most alarmed their elders, the long hair, the new dances, their love for negro music, their use of marijuana, their mystical attitude toward sex, are all tools of their rebellion. They have turned these tools against the totalitarian fabric of American society, and they mean to change it. From the beginning, America has been a schizophrenic nation. Its two conflicting images of itself were never reconciled, because never before has the survival of its most cherished myths made a reconciliation mandatory. Once before, during the bitter struggle between North and South climaxed by the Civil War, the two images of America came into conflict, although whites North and South scarcely understood it. The image of America held by its most alienated citizens was advanced neither by the North nor South. It was perhaps best expressed by Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery in 1817, escaped to the North, and became the greatest leader-spokesman for the blacks of his era. In words that can still, years later, arouse an audience of black Americans, Frederick Douglass delivered, in 1852, a scorching indictment in his 4th of July oration in Rochester. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him more bombast, fraud, deception, impiety and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. Your boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while the whole political power of the nation, as embodied in the great two political parties, is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 millions of your countrymen. You hurl your anathemas at the crown-headed tyrants of Russia and Austria, and pride yourselves on your democratic institutions, while you yourselves consent to be the mere tools and bodyguards of the tyrants of Virginia and Carolina. You invite to your shores fugitives of oppression from abroad, honor them with banquets, greet them with ovations, cheer them, toast them, salute them, protect them, and pour out your money to them like water. But the fugitive from your own land you advertise, hunt, arrest, shoot, and kill. You glory in your refinement and your universal education. Yet you maintain a system as barbarous and dreadful as ever stained the character of a nation. A system begun in avarice, supported in pride, and perpetuated in cruelty. You shed tears over fallen Hungary, and make the sad story of her wrongs the theme of your poets, statesmen, and orators, till your gallant sons are ready to fly to arms to vindicate her cause against the oppressor. But in regard to the 10,000 wrongs of the American slave, you would enforce the strictest silence, and would hail him as an enemy of the nation who dares to make these wrongs the subject of public discourse. The most alienated view of America was preached by the abolitionists and by Harriet Beecher Stowe in her Uncle Tom's Cabin. But such a view of America was too distasteful to receive wide attention, and serious debate about America's image and her reality was engaged in only on the fringes of society. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence to the contrary, most white Americans have found it possible, after steadying their rattled nerves, to settle comfortably back into their vaunted belief that America is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With the Constitution for a rudder and the Declaration of Independence as its guiding star, the ship of state is sailing always toward a brighter vision of freedom and justice for all. Because there is no common ground between these two contradictory images of America, they had to be kept apart. But the moment the blacks were led into the white world, led out of the voiceless and faceless cages of their ghettos, singing, walking, talking, dancing, writing, and orating their image of America and of Americans, the white world was suddenly challenged to match its practice to its preachments. And this is why those whites who abandon the white image of America and adopt the black are greeted with such unmitigated hostility by their elders. For all these years, whites have been taught to believe in the myth they preached, while Negroes have had to face the bitter reality of what America practiced. But without the lies and distortions, white Americans would not have been able to do the things they have done. When whites are forced to look honestly upon the objective proof of their deeds, the cement of mendacity holding white society together swiftly disintegrates. On the other hand, the core of the black world's vision remains intact, and in fact begins to expand and spread into the psychological territory vacated by the non-viable white lies, i.e., into the minds of young whites. It is remarkable how the system worked for so many years, how the majority of whites remained effectively unaware of any contradiction between their view of the world and that world itself. The mechanism by which this was rendered possible requires examination at this point. Let us recall that the white man, in order to justify slavery and later on to justify segregation, elaborated a complex, all-pervasive myth which at one time classified the black man as a subhuman beast of burden. The myth was progressively modified, gradually elevating the blacks on the scale of evolution, following their slowly changing status until the plateau of separate but equal was reached at the close of the 19th century. During slavery, the black was seen as a mindless, supermasculine menial, forced to do the back-breaking work. He was conceived in terms of his ability to do such work, field niggas, etc. The white man administered the plantation, doing all the thinking, exercising omnipotent power over the slaves. He had little difficulty disassociating himself from the black slaves, and he could not conceive of their positions being reversed or even reversible. Blacks and whites being conceived as mutually exclusive types, Those attributes imputed to the blacks could not also be imputed to the whites, at least not in equal degree, without blurring the line separating the races. These images were based upon the social function of the two races, the work they performed. The ideal white man was one who knew how to use his head, who knew how to manage and control things and get things done. Those whites who were not in a position to perform these functions nevertheless aspired to them. The ideal black man was one who did exactly as he was told, and did it efficiently and cheerfully. Slaves, said Frederick Douglass, are generally expected to sing as well as to work. As the black man's position and function became more varied, the images of white and black, having become stereotypes, lagged behind. The separate but equal doctrine was promulgated by the Supreme Court in 1896. It had the same purpose domestically as the open door policy toward China in the international arena: to stabilize a situation and subordinate a non-white population so that racist exploiters could manipulate those people according to their own selfish interests. These doctrines were foisted off as the epitome of enlightened justice, the highest expression of morality, sanctified by religion, justified by philosophy, and legalized by the Supreme Court. Separate but equal was enforced by day agencies of the law, and by the KKK and company, under cover of night. Booker T. Washington, the Martin Luther King of his day, accepted separate but equal in the name of all Negroes. W.E.B. Du Bois denounced it. Separate but equal marked the last stage of the white man's flight into cultural neurosis, and the beginning of the black man's frantic striving to assert his humanity and equalize his position with the white. Blacks ventured into all fields of endeavor to which they could gain entrance. Their goal was to present in all fields a performance that would equal or surpass that of the whites. It was long axiomatic among blacks that a black had to be twice as competent as a white in any field in order to win grudging recognition from the whites. This produced a pathological motivation in the blacks to equal or surpass the whites, and a pathological motivation in the whites to maintain a distance from the blacks. This is the rack on which black and white Americans receive their delicious torture. At first, there was the color bar, flatly denying the blacks entrance to certain spheres of activity. When this no longer worked, and blacks invaded sector after sector of American life and economy, the whites evolved other methods of keeping their distance. The illusion of the Negro's inferior nature had to be maintained. One device evolved by the whites was to tab whatever the blacks did with the prefix Negro. We had Negro literature, Negro athletes, Negro music, Negro doctors, Negro politicians, Negro workers. The malignant ingeniousness of this device is that although it accurately describes an objective biological fact, or at least a sociological fact in America, it concealed the paramount psychological fact that to the white mind, prefixing anything with Negro automatically consigned it to an inferior category. A well-known example of the white necessity to deny due credit to blacks is in the realm of music. White musicians were famous for going to Harlem and other Negro cultural centers literally to steal the black man's music, carrying it back across the color line into the great white world and passing off the watered down loot as their own original creations. Blacks, meanwhile, were ridiculed as Negro musicians playing inferior coon music. The Negro Revolution at home and national liberation movements abroad have unceremoniously shattered the world of fantasy in which the whites have been living. It is painful that many do not yet see that their fantasy world has been rendered uninhabitable in the last half of the 20th century. But it is away from this world that the white youth of today are turning. The paper tiger hero, James Bond, offering the whites a triumphant image of themselves, is saying what many whites want desperately to hear reaffirmed. I am still the white man, lord of the land, licensed to kill, and the world is still an empire at my feet. James Bond feeds on that secret little anxiety, the psychological white backlash felt in some degree by most whites alive. It is exasperating to see little brown men and little yellow men from the mysterious Orient and the opaque black men of Africa, to say nothing of these impudent American Negroes, who come to the UN and talk smart to us, who are scurrying all over our globe in their strange modes of dress, much as if they were new, unpleasant arrivals from another planet. Many whites believe in their ulcers that it is only a matter of time before the Marines get the signal to round up these truants and put them back securely in their cages. But it is away from this fantasy world that the white youth of today are turning. In the world revolution now under the way, the initiative rests with the people of color. The growing numbers of white youth are repudiating their heritage of blood and taking people of color as their heroes and models is a tribute not only to their insight but to the resilience of the human spirit. For today, the heroes of the initiative are people not usually thought of as white. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Kwame Nkrumah, Mao Zedong, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Robert F. Williams, Malcolm X, Ben Bella, John Lewis, Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Paris Moses, Ho Chi Minh, Stokely Carmichael, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Foreman, Chow En-lai. The white youth of today have begun to react to the fact that the, quote, American way of life, unquote, is a fossil of history. What do they care if their old bald-headed and crew-cut elders don't dig their caveman mops? They couldn't care less about the old, stiff-assed honkies who don't like the new dances, frog, monkey, jerk, swim, watusi. All they know is that it feels good to swing to way-out body rhythms instead of drag-assing across the dance floor like zombies to the dead beat of mind-smothered Mickey Mouse music. Is it any wonder that the youth have lost all respect for their elders, for law and order, when for as long as they can remember, all they've witnessed is a monumental bickering over the Negro's place in American society and the right of people around the world to be left alone by outside powers? They have witnessed the law, both domestic and international, being spat upon by those who do not like its terms. Is it any wonder, then, that they feel justified by sitting in and freedom riding and breaking laws made by lawless men? Old funny-styled, zipper-mouthed, political night riders know nothing but to haul out an investigating committee to look into the disturbance to find the cause of the unrest among the youth. Look into a mirror. The cause is you, Mr. and Mrs. Yesterday, you and your forked tongues. A young white today cannot help but recoil from the base deeds of his people. On every side, on every continent, he sees racial arrogance, savage brutality toward the conquered and subjugated people, genocide. He sees the human cargo of the slave trade. He sees the systematic extermination of American Indians. He sees the civilized nations of Europe fighting in imperial depravity over the lands of other people and over possession of the very people themselves. There seems to be no end to the ghastly deeds of which his people are guilty. Guilty! The slaughter of the Jews by the Germans, the dropping of atomic bombs on the Japanese people, these deeds weigh heavily upon the prostrate souls and tumultuous consciousness of the white youth. The white heroes, their hands dripping with blood, are dead. The young whites know that the colored people of the world, Afro-Americans included, do not seek revenge for their suffering. They seek the same things the white rebel wants: an end to war and exploitation. Black and white, the young rebels are free people, free in a way that Americans have never been before in the history of their country, and they are outraged. There is in America today a generation of white youth that is truly worthy of a black man's respect, and this is a rare event in the foul annals of American history. From the beginning of the contact between blacks and whites, there has been very little reason for a black man to respect a white, with such exceptions as John Brown and others lesser known. But respect commands itself, and it can neither be given nor withheld when it is due. If a man like Malcolm X could change and repudiate racism, if I myself and other former Muslims can change, if young whites can change, then there's hope for America. It was certainly strange to find myself, while steeped in the doctrine that all whites were devils by nature, commanded by the heart to applaud and acknowledge respect for these young whites, despite the fact that they are descendants of the masters, and I the descendant of slave. The sins of the fathers are visited upon the heads of the children, but only if the children continue in the evil deeds of the fathers.